again, a little bit about myself. I was adopted at 6 months. I was raised here in the Twin Cities in the Minneapolis area. Many of you might know this, but Minnesota is home to the largest population of Korean adoptees per capita around the world. So we do have this kind of unique community. We also have a special uniqueness in that about 2/3, about 66% of the Korean population in Minnesota is comprised of the adoptee community. This is very different than the rest of the United States, where the percentage is on average about 5 to 10%. So if you're like me and you grew up in camp culture, you think that everyone that is Korean is adopted. You end up leaving Minnesota and you realize that's not the case. So, there's some really great things about that. On the one hand, it's pretty normal. It feels good to know that you have your people. But then you leave and you realize, oh, not everyone's celebrating that, and that's not always a great thing, or it's not a normal thing. As I mentioned, I was involved with a lot of different camps growing up, both as a camper and then later as a counselor. And for me, it's been very important because I loved that involvement as a young person, to then as a teenager and in college and then as an adult to give back to the community and just to provide those opportunities, because it was so crucial for me to have that connection and to feel like I know where my tribe is, I know where I belong, and all those moments and those times when I've been uncertain about who I am or where I'm going, I know that I also have a group and a community of people that also understand my experience. Later, as an adult, as I mentioned, my involvement extended and grew into work at Goal in Korea. I am very appreciative to the founders of Goal, Amy Nasker, and also Cho Mihi, Natalie Lemoyne, and others that also kind of forged that way for my journey as an adult to go to Korea. Through my work at Goal, I used to organize a conference every summer for about 5 years, and that's how I got to know originally Chris Winston through Con, and now Stacy and the board, as well as my involvement in the past with ICA and OKF and other organizations, and then lastly also with CAM Center here in Minnesota. So just a brief introduction, because this project that we're working on is funded through the Minnesota Department of Health and through specifically the Korean Adoptees Ministry Center. It's an organization based here in Minnesota, founded in 2000 by Pastor Sung-Chul Park, to serve the community of Korean adoptees and families through a variety of cultural programs, community building, outreach, and of course the ministry. As I mentioned, he's a pastor, so there is a Christian flavor to the organization. I've highlighted just a few of the different things that CAM Center does on a regular basis, and then on the bottom in red, the pastoral counseling services is kind of where all of this comes together. So CAM Center, part of the reason why it was originally founded was noticing that at times adoptees in our community struggle, and we have had members in our community facing homelessness, facing imprisonment without any support and family, and then also those adoptees and families that contact the organization in moments of high crisis. So we're going to talk really briefly now about suicide in the media. So I've been putting up a few examples that I think all of us here in the room are aware of in the last month, just to help kind of normalize that, we are paying attention, and there's been more focus on suicide with well-known names. So for example, Kate Spade, fashion icon, known for her colorful and cheerful and affordable designs. And my own social media feed, I had a number of comments and stories. And usually it's kind of just this sort of shock and awe, like, wow, she seems so great. She's so happy. She has this, really awesome brand. Why would she commit suicide? She doesn't seem like one of those people. I think that's often a comment that comes up, and we'll talk a little bit more about, well, what does that mean? Anthony Bourdain, who a few days later also was in the media, who committed suicide. And I will say this because I have a lot of people of color and a lot of Korean adoptees and a lot of Asian Americans that are connected to me on Facebook. This one hit a lot harder because for some of us, you know, watching someone like Anthony Bourdain bring food and culture and people together has been so helpful and meaningful in our own journey in connecting to Korea and connecting to Asia and connecting to places far away from where we grew up to help make us feel more interested, to show that our cultures, to show that where we come from is interesting and to be noticed. And then I'm giving you guys one pretty visible example in our own community, a Korean adoptee, Philip Clay. I did not know him personally, but I do know some people here in the room did and have advocated for him. But for those of you who are not familiar with him, Philip Clay was a Korean adoptee who arrived in the US at age 8 in 1983. I believe he grew up in Pennsylvania. He later, though, was deported to South Korea in 2012 because he lacked US citizenship and had experienced years of struggles with mental health, as well as illegal drug use and things that just got him in trouble with the law. And unfortunately, we have this loophole in our US immigration laws that was, to my understanding, meant for illegal US immigrants, not for Korean adoptees who didn't get their Korean, US citizenship. That has resulted in a number of international adoptees who have felonies being deported back to the land of their birth. Philip later struggled in Korea due to language and cultural barriers, and as I understand, some maybe untreated mental health issues. He ended his life on May 21st, 2017. And I bring him up because he has been visible. If you guys are on Facebook or you're connected to adoptee communities, his death really sparked a lot of outrage and caused many of us a lot of deep pain to just kind of think about, you know, what happened? Why was he not supported? I just wanted to share this with you guys. We have others, and I don't have everyone's picture. I'm not going to talk about everyone's name, but just to put kind of a face and a way for us to connect why this is important, why we're talking about this today. So kind of moving on, I'm going to talk really briefly about what do we already know about suicide in our community, in the internationally adopted community. What we do know, and I believe many of you, if you are on social media, you pay attention, we do know that the risk of suicide attempts and also dying by suicide seems to be higher in the adoptee community than in general. I'm just going to mention two pretty well-known and cited studies about this phenomenon. The first was in 2002, based on internationally adopted people in Sweden, and the study by Hearn, Lindblad, Vernlung found that adoptees have a high risk for severe mental health problems and, quote, social maladjustment in adolescence and young adulthood. The study cites a 3 to 5 times more likelihood to either attempt or die from suicide than non-adoptees. In this particular study, there were 3 main populations that were looked at: international adoptees, native-born Swedes, non-adopted, as well as an immigrant population. Sweden has sort of a special set of data where the entire country is followed, so this is pretty unique. In this particular study, some of the risk factors that were also noted to contribute to these higher rates of mental illness, or to these higher rates of suicidal behaviors or attempts, were that there were higher rates of mental illness, for example, depression. Adoptees, because of our unique circumstances to become available to be adopted, we may have some other challenges around attachment or disruption in our care, which makes sense, right? Anybody who has moved from one mom to another, let alone from one country to another. I mean, that's just a huge change. Substance use and abuse by biological parents is a contributing factor. I do believe in our population of Korean adoptees, this tends to be low compared to domestic populations for adoption and foster care in the US as well as for some of the other countries. Poverty, and then also just that disconnect from our culture and birth origins. Many of the risk factors experienced by the adoptees in this group, and I believe the number is about 6,500 for the adoptee subset. Many of the risk factors experienced at higher rates were also similar to some of the immigrant group, which I think had about 4,500 people in it. I do want to note that actually it wasn't just international adoptees, but I believe domestic as well. So a study done in 2013 here at the University of Minnesota, kind of drawing off of that previous research, looked at, is this phenomenon similar here in the US? Because that was specific to that cohort of Swedish adoptees. And similarly, in the study here, US adoptees, and I want to make a point to say that both of these samples are on adolescent to young adult. The study here found that adoptees were 4 times more likely than non-adoptees to attempt suicide. They didn't have a number actually on the completed suicides. So kind of knowing this and what we see with some of our folks in community who are talking about these issues is that, we have concerns. We have concerns that we may be at risk for suicide or suicidal behaviors. So I want you guys just to think about that, but I don't want you to take that with you as this means that we are going to harm ourselves. This does not mean that, okay? Just really briefly, a couple years ago, or several years back, CAM Center has been involved with the Minnesota Department of Health and had been asking for several years because CAM Center receives, I'm guessing, a disproportionate number of adoptees contacting them in crisis. So it feels like and it seems like adoptees are very much suffering a lot. And it's not to say that we aren't and we don't have issues, we do. But CAM Center wanted to know, here in Minnesota, we have this large group of Korean adoptees. What is going on? What kind of supports are available? How can we support our community, and how can we talk about these issues in ways that garners the support that we need? So this Adopting Mental Health and Suicide project was created when CAM Center actually got funding a few years ago from the Department of Health. We are also working with 3 other Asian American organizations, and we're able to get a grant because we're partnering with some other organizations here. The South Asian, like Indian community, as well as the Korean community from Myanmar and Burma, as well as the Korean immigrant community. So it's actually kind of a joy to be working with these other Asian communities to know what they're dealing with in terms of mental health and suicide as well. So the reason why we created this was to identify further risk factors and barriers. In our particular survey and study, we're looking at adult adoptees. Not a lot of information is available on adult adoptees. So the 2 studies I referred to before looked at adolescents, maybe into young adulthood. We also obviously want to raise awareness. We want to be able to talk about this, right? We don't want to normalize it and say it's okay, and when we're hurting that we hurt ourselves, but we do want to be able to provide a space where it's okay that we talk about this. Of course, we're also looking to increase our community supports and resources if something were to happen or following the death of someone in our community, and also ultimately to reduce the number of deaths, right? I just listed our team up there, as I mentioned, Pastor Park, myself, and then we're working with a public health professor, Hyun Kim, and then his graduate student to move forward with the project. So we started off with focus groups in the fall of 2016. We had two groups to help us kind of familiarize us a little bit more with what is the state of mental health and suicide issues in the community. The first was a group of mental health professionals that are familiar with the Korean adoptee experience. Majority of those participants were adoptees themselves, but we also had Korean Americans that work with the adoptee population here. And I also did outreach to other non-adopted professionals who just couldn't make it. And then, of course, us, because we're the ones who are being looked at, adult Korean adoptees. So just briefly, a few key themes that I want to talk about, which helps to normalize maybe why we might think about exiting or why we might experience more emotional anguish. So in the focus groups, participants talked about lacking a sense of belonging while growing up, lacking role models who not only look like us, but also share our experience. So what that might mean is, for example, for some of us like me that went to Korean camp growing up, a lot of the mentors and the teachers were second-generation Koreans. They're awesome, they're very well-meaning, but they might not have that experience of what it's like to be an adoptee and to be confused. We might be able to talk about race and being different, but many of them came from like educated, wealthy Korean American families. And for someone like me, I was like, well, I don't know that you have my experience. So maybe some disconnect there. The second one, this conflicting messages about love and adoption equals separation. I think many of you guys are familiar that in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, it's changing now, but we've heard the story that your Korean mother loved you so much. She loved you so much that she gave you up. That's a really messed up message, and I just want to say that, although because of the cultural pieces, it makes sense. But for us, if you love somebody, does that mean that you do anything and everything you can to take care of them? You know, so this has a huge impact on how we think about relationships as we grow older, how we learn to trust or not trust. And then lastly, and this is just a few of the themes, oftentimes adoptees may experience or engage in some difficult behaviors, some acting out behaviors. We might have a lot of confusing feelings that we can't make sense of. And as much as our families and our communities and our friends love us, they're not adopted. A lot of times they're not the same race. They just don't understand. And if you don't have a community, if you're not connected to our tribe here, you just start feeling like you're alone or something's wrong with you. So those are some of the themes that came out of the focus groups that helped to guide some of the questions that went into the survey that we put together. And I realize I'm looking at time. I'm kind of don't have a lot of time left, but I'll try not to rush through this. We came up with a survey. We distributed it in an online format. We looked at adoption demographics, culture, heritage, depression, some suicidal behaviors, other sort of known risk factors. This was distributed online between, for about a month, I guess, the end of September through the end of October in 2016. Through our recruitment, we did a lot of outreach through direct email, focus groups, the University of Minnesota International Adoption Project, through publications like the Korean Quarterly, posters at local businesses here, reached out to the adoption agencies, Children's Home Society and Lutheran Social Services, as well as MinAdopt, and at least 25 plus Facebook groups that Korean adoptees are part of, as well as Goal, because I used to work there, and then word of mouth through some of the researchers and leaders that I've met over the years. So even though there's 81 questions, the average time to complete was about 10, 12 minutes. Participants had to be 18 and up. And in all, we came up with 368 respondents. 120 identified that they grew up in Minnesota, with an additional actually 20 that said they live here now. We also offered mental health resources and crisis connection in case anyone was experiencing some upset or needed immediate support. So a couple of things about Korean adoptees, and maybe you guys already know this, but we are highly educated. We're very, very educated. In the sample of the Minnesota respondents, over 80% said they had at least a 4-year college or above. This is compared to about 1/3 of the adult population in the United States. were highly employed. I think for those that are either part-time or not employed, they're probably staying at home raising their kids for the most part. And then kind of unique to Minnesota, over 60% of the adoptees from Minnesota, so this is about 120 people, said that growing up they had some involvement in Korean adoptee community, whereas the rest of the adoptees from other parts of the U.S., only 25% said that they were involved with camp or something like that. So what I want to say about this is, according to Pastor Park, when we looked at the data, was like, oh my gosh, when South Koreans see this, they say, adoption, it's so successful. So I want to keep that in mind, right? Like if we came from poverty and we came from circumstances where we had no opportunities, this says we are okay, right? And this is in the research, not just the suicide research, but adoptee well-being, overall, like even though there is higher rates of mental health issues in the adoptee community, when it comes to us, we are doing great. But this hides all of the things that we struggle with. And this is also why this was interesting and important to me, because I saw this. I saw some of this when I was working in community. Just a few stats on some of the depression and suicide rates in our sample. Over 50% of the respondents said that they have received in their lifetime so far a clinical diagnosis of depression. We don't know exactly what kind, but major depression or persistent depressive disorder or short-term, we don't know. But compared to only about 17% of the general US population that will get a major depression diagnosis, it's a lot higher, 3 times higher, right? In our sample of females, almost a quarter reported that they've attempted suicide in their lifetime. This is compared to a 2 to 4.6% of lifetime prevalence of all sort of adults in the US. And then also 100% of the females that reported having attempted suicide also reported receiving a clinical diagnosis of depression. And this is just based on that 120 respondents in the Minnesota group. And we left out the males because I think there was 15 in that sample, and none of them reported attempting suicide. And as you can see, just kind of from this chart, which actually includes information from all of the sample, that we do have just, at least a 50% rate or above of receiving a depression diagnosis, and then over 60% saying that they've had other mental health diagnoses, which might include ADHD, anxiety, PTSD, a number of other issues, eating disorders. So just very briefly, because I think this is important, some of the protective factors that we did garner from our study so far, that adoptees who reported that they had some sense of belonging or connection growing up fared better. Those that also said that they had at least one parent that really understood them and connected with them did better and were not at risk in the same ways. Those that are working part-time, I'm guessing that's because they're not as stressed with work. Those in their 40s, so maybe once we get past our 20s, our teens and 20s and 30s, and we get into our 40s and find our stride, it gets a little better. And interestingly, and we're not going to go too much into this, but for some reason in our data, we found that adoptees that had a sibling that's not adopted, somehow that looked like it could be some protective factor. I don't really know what that's about. If you guys have thoughts, we can talk about that later. Risk factors are things that we kind of know already for those who are at risk to attempt or commit suicide. A history of mental health issues. Another big one was that they know another Korean adoptee that has attempted suicide. But we also know just from the general population that that is a risk factor. If you know of somebody who's attempted suicide, especially a close relative or a friend, that's just something that's going to, that may impact your own thoughts of thinking even about that possibility. I put down non-binary gender status. I think we just had transgender or other, just kind of a smaller uptick there. We didn't have enough in our sample to really do a whole lot with that. We did also find that adoptees that reported that have been to Korea had like a 3 times higher likelihood of at least reporting on kind of depression. I want to really contextualize that and normalize this. I think for many of us who've been to Korea know that it kind of just opens up a lot for us. And I think that if we continue to be part of community, we explore what that means to us. And quite frankly, if we can do something to understand what that's about, it gets a lot better. It gets a lot better. And then there was an increased risk for those that reported having a sibling that's also adopted from Korea. My guess is, and we don't know for sure, but my guess is that if the rates are higher in our community already, it's possible that if it's not us, maybe our sibling might have attempted suicide. And then that kind of just goes to the knowing somebody. But that was in the data. And it's not to say because you have a sibling adopted from Korea that you are at a higher risk. I want to talk about just, some biases and limitations to this study. First of all, because we did outreach to, through social media, through our organizations, we're connecting with people who either one are already connected to community, right? We don't know about adoptees who are not connected to community, what they're doing, how they're doing, what they're feeling, what they're thinking. And also because the survey is about mental health, maybe those that are interested in mental health that may have had issues with mental health, they might be more likely to respond. We also don't know the ages when adoptees were experiencing suicidal thoughts or behaviors. So again, this might be more in that adolescent, early adulthood range. But we didn't ask when did that happen. So that's an area of further exploration. We also, for the purpose of our study, we're not tracking completed suicides. It's very difficult to do. But we are working with the Minnesota Department of Health on this to try to track that. And actually, as a result of our work, they started tracking in their death statistics if a person was adopted or not as a variable to help add to the work that we're doing. And we have plans to continue that effort with other states and with the CDC. So one positive thing that we came up from at least looking at the statistics of the adoptees we were able to identify in the last 5 years in Minnesota, the rate of adoptee suicide is much, much, much lower in Minnesota than the rate of suicide in Minnesota, which is going up quite a lot. Okay. Okay, sorry. So I do want to leave you with that, right? We know that there are higher risks. A lot of that comes from our adoption, disrupted attachment, maybe unrecognized, or things that look just like mental health that might have a lot to do just with our experience of being disconnected and not knowing what to do with our feelings. Not having people in our community that look like us. So just a few of the next steps going forward. Connecting it with sense of belonging and having families that are connected to us. Having events, having community like CON, like adult adoptee spaces, like this. This is where we're going to get the support that we need. This is what's going to help us. We plan to do some more sessions for both adoptive parents as well as adoptees that are parents, as many of us are now. We're doing some trainings on suicide prevention, as well as here locally, connecting more of our community of mental health providers to provide referrals, as well as moving forward to publish on our actual study and then presenting at presentations like this. I just have that little box in the corner, kind of bringing it back to Philip Clay. For adoptees in our community, I know some of you are aware of this issue around lacking citizenship, but we also need to do some more support for our brothers and sisters who are not currently U.S. citizens to make sure that at least this other piece of their vulnerable status is not not exploited. I have a couple examples of different parent sessions that we did in the last year or two. But particularly, I want to point out this last one, and this is kind of for all of you guys that are from different parts of the U.S. or coming from other countries, if that's even, if some of the attendings are here, is really as leaders, if you're not a mental health professional, you don't have to be. But we want to help you guys start connecting to resources to help train like people in your organization on how you can refer and how you can support adoptees in our community, right? This is a seemingly big responsibility. It's a scary topic, but there's a lot of help out there. So we here in Minnesota partnered with the National Alliance on Mental Illness. There's lots of trainings that you guys can set up just to know how to refer and how to help, how to know what the warning signs are, because that's oftentimes what we come up with is we don't know what those warning signs are. So there are some trainings. If you guys have questions, like I can give you more information about that. And then just some, very general but helpful resources, knowing who to call. So the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. You can also crisis the text line. We and a number of us with the theme here at CON are mental health therapists as well, working together to refer and support communities. So knowing who some of those people are can be helpful. And then just connecting people at least to our community, right? We might not be able to help the person right away, but we just know that at least if we have other people that are part of, who is and what is supporting an individual that might be going through a hard time, if you can get through that hard time, it might get better. So I know I have to wrap up. If you guys have any questions for 1 or 2 minutes, I don't know. No? Okay, no questions. If you guys do have questions, please find me. I'm actually doing a mindfulness session right after this at 8:45 next door. You can come there or find me throughout the conference. But thank you so much for listening. I hope it was helpful.